The morning I signed for those 45 acres, it was a Tuesday in late March of 2011. And the sky was the color of old tin, that flat pewter that promises nothing and delivers a slow, cold drizzle by 10. I was 61 that spring, and I had no business at a tax sale, or so everyone within 20 miles was happy to tell me. The county held its delinquent property auction on the courthouse steps, which is a phrase that sounds grander than it is, because the courthouse steps are 4 concrete slabs and a handrail somebody spray-painted the wrong shade of gray. There were maybe 9 of us standing around in canvas coats, most of them men who buy tax parcels the way other men buy lottery tickets, and one fellow from the city in a jacket too clean for the weather who never bid on anything and left before the 3rd parcel. The piece I wanted was listed as 45 acres, more or less, described in the ledger only as unimproved wooded and thicket, delinquent 7 years. Minimum bid $1,140 to cover the back taxes and the recording fees. Nobody else raised a hand. The auctioneer looked at me the way you look at a woman who has clearly wandered into the wrong line, and he said going once, going twice, and then it was mine for the minimum, and I wrote a check with a hand that was steadier than I felt. I want to be honest about my reasons before I go any further, because the version that got around town was not the true one. By noon the diner had a version of the story, and the version had grown, the way these things do, until I had supposedly paid $10,000 for a briar patch a snake wouldn't live in. What I had actually bought was a hunch and a piece of paper, and a memory I had been carrying since I was a girl of 8 or 9, riding in the cab of my grandfather's truck along the ridge road that borders that ground, and hearing him say, in that flat way of his, "There's good water on the Hollis place, there's a cold spring back in there." 40 not, in the drought of 34, not once. He said it more than once over the years, always the same, "There's good water on the Hollis place." And then he died in 1979 and took whatever else he knew about it with him. Or so I believed for a long time. The Hollis place, by 2011, had been through 3 owners, a bankruptcy, and 7 years of no one paying the taxes, and it had gone so far back to briar and multiflora rose and honeysuckle that you could not walk 10 feet into it without bleeding. From the ridge road, it looked like a green wall. From the air, if you'd have flown over, it looked like nothing at all, just an unbroken canopy of thornbrush swallowing 45 acres whole. And that is what the neighbor saw when he came down to the fence that first week. The neighbor with the too clean truck and the habit of being certain. He rolled his window down, and he was polite about it. He always was polite, and he said, "What are you going to do with that?" And I told him I was going to run goats on it. He didn't laugh. He was too well raised to laugh. But he did that thing where a man looks past you at the thing itself and lets the thing make his argument for him. "Goats," he said. "On that, I've seen goats. You'd need a bulldozer and about $40,000, and then you'd have 45 acres of nothing worth having." He wasn't cruel. He was just sure. And I'll own that I did not have a good answer for him, because I did not yet know what the ground knew, and I did not yet know what the goats would find. I told him goats work slow, but they get there, and he allowed that maybe they did, and he drove on up the ridge road in that clean truck, and I stood at the fence and looked at my green wall and thought, Lord, what have I done? What I had done was spend $1,140 I could mostly afford and buy myself a fight I was not sure I could win. But I had also bought that memory, that flat, certain voice saying good water, and a person my age has learned to weigh a childhood memory of her grandfather against the certainty of a neighbor in a clean truck and come out trusting the grandfather. So the next thing I did was go looking for the goats. I did not want dairy goats, and I did not want the fancy show goats people keep like dogs. I wanted brush goats, the scrubby hardy kind that will eat a thorn bush down to the cane and then eat the cane. And I found a man 2 counties over who was thinning his herd and sold me 31 head for $40 apiece, $1,240, which meant I now had more money in goats than I had in land. 22 nannies, 8 of them bred, 2 young billies, and 7 weanlings that would grow into the work. I hauled them home in 2 loads in a borrowed stock trailer over the course of a long Saturday, and I turned them out along the one edge of the property where the thicket thinned enough to string a temporary fence, and I stood back to watch them, and they stood there in a nervous knot and looked at the green wall the same way I had, like it was a thing that might eat them instead. And then one old nanny, gray around the muzzle, stepped forward and took a mouthful of multiflora rose, thorns and all, and chewed it like it was nothing, and the rest of them followed her in, and that was the beginning. I want to tell you, it went fast. It did not go fast. A brush coat eats a great deal, but 45 acres is 45 acres, and I learned that first spring that the work of clearing land with animals is really the work of managing where the animals are, which meant fence and more fence and moving fence. And I spent that whole summer learning to build electric netting into ground, so choked with root and stone that a post would not drive. I paddocked them small, maybe a half acre at a time, and I left them until they had it eaten to the dirt and the bark stripped off the little woody stuff. And then I moved them, and behind them the ground looked like a different country, like somebody had run a mower 10 feet tall across it, except a mower doesn't fertilize as it goes, and a mower can't reach up and pull down a honeysuckle vine the way a goat standing on her back legs can. By the end of that first summer, they had cleared maybe 6 acres. And I could walk those 6 acres, and what they revealed underneath the briar was ground. I had never seen old ground with the shapes of things in it. There was an old fence line of hand-set stone, tumbled but readable. There was the footprint of what had been an orchard once, a dozen ancient apple trees so overgrown they'd forgotten they were trees. And the goats worked around those, and I trimmed them back, and 2 of them fruited the next year. And there was, running down the middle of the cleared ground, a swale, a low soft line in the land, where the earth stayed dark and damp when everything around it had dried. And I stood in that swale in the heat of August, with my boots sinking a half-inch into black mud, and I heard my grandfather's voice again, "Good water on the Hollis place." All right. It's down here somewhere. That winter, the winter of 2011 into 2012, is when I found the notebook, and finding it changed the shape of everything I thought I was doing. My grandfather had left his farm to my uncle, and my uncle had let most of it go. But there was a cedar chest that had come down to me full of the odds and ends nobody else wanted, quilts and canning jars and a coffee can of buttons, and at the bottom of it, under a wool blanket that smelled of the last century, was a bundle of composition books tied with baling twine. Marbled covers, black and white, the corners gone soft as cloth. The kind of notebook a man buys at the feed store for a nickel and keeps in his coat. There were 6 of them, and they were my grandfather's field books, going back to the 1932nd, and they were not diaries. There was nothing in them about how he felt. They were nothing but weather and work. So many inches of rain, so many bushels off the north field. Terse, technical, and dry as a corn husk. And I read them the way you'd read scripture, by a single bulb out in the barn where I keep such things. And I want to be honest, I read them slow, because I did not yet know what I was looking for, and I was not ready to find it. It took me the better part of that winter to get to the book that mattered. It was the oldest one, the 1934 one, the drought year, and most of it was a long, dry catalogue of a man watching his fields die. And then, in the middle of July, in the worst of that summer, there was an entry that stopped me. Hollis Springs still running, it said, and then, and this is what I keep coming back to, and this is what raised the hair on my arms out there in the cold barn. Cold and clear, must be 12 foot down. They covered it proper. And then, in the margin, in pencil gone brown with the years, underlined twice, 3 words and a question mark that my grandfather had put there and never answered. Where's the head? Where's the head, meaning where does the water come out of the ground? Where is the source, the spring head itself? Because a spring that runs cold in a drought and never quits is a spring worth finding, and somebody, some Hollis, 100 years before my grandfather, had covered it proper, had built something over it to keep it clean. And my grandfather had known the water was there, but had never in his long careful life found the head of it. Covered it proper. I read that phrase 100 times that winter. I did not know yet what covered proper meant, whether it meant a springhouse or a cistern or a simple stone box, but I knew that somewhere under my 45 acres of thorn brush was something a man had built to last, and I knew my goats were walking over it or near it a little more each week. And I put the notebook back in the chest, because I wasn't ready. Because there is a thing that happens when a hope you've carried since childhood suddenly has a page and a date, and a man's own underlined question behind it, and the thing that happens is that you get afraid to be wrong. So, I let it sit. I let the winter pass. But I read that swale different. Now I knew where to look. The next spring, 2012, I moved the goats down into the swale on purpose, and I fenced them tight along that dark, damp line, and I let them eat it to the ground. And then I got down on my hands and knees where they had cleared it, and I started reading the land the way my grandfather read the weather. Water tells on itself if you know how to listen. There were rushes growing in a line, and there was a place where the ground was greener than green even in a dry week. And there was, when I got the briar off it, a faint, low mound running crossways to the swale, a ridge maybe 2 feet high and grown over so long it looked natural, except nothing in nature makes a straight line like that. I probed it with a length of rebar, just pushing it down into the soft ground, and mostly it went down easy through the black muck. 3 feet, 4 feet, and then in one spot it stopped hard at about 18 inches, stopped on something that rang up the steel into my hand, and I moved a foot over, and it stopped hard again. And I moved again and again, and mapped out a rectangle, about 8 foot by 10 foot, of something solid and flat and level under 18 inches of muck and root. And I sat back on my heels, with the rain starting again, and I said out loud, to nobody, to my grandfather, I suppose, there you are. There you are. It took me and a hired boy the better part of 2 weeks that summer to dig it out by hand, because I would not bring a machine in on it. A machine would have cracked it, and my grandfather's own book had said they covered it proper, and I was not going to be the one who covered it improper. We dug with spades, and we hauled the muck out in buckets, and the goats stood at the fence and watched us like we'd finally gone, as foolish as the county had suspected all along, and what we uncovered, inch by careful inch, was stone. Cut stone. Not filled stone thrown together, but shaped limestone, dressed square, set without mortar by somebody who knew exactly what they were doing. A low building, maybe 7 feet by 10, dug half into the ground, with walls 2 feet thick, and a roof of long, flat stone slabs laid across like a table, and every joint of it so tight after all those years. After a century and more, that when we got the last of the muck off the roof slabs and pried one up on its edge, the air that came out of that dark space underneath was cold. Cold and clean. In the middle of a July afternoon, cold enough that the boy stepped back from it, and I put my hand down into that darkness and I felt the water. It was a springhouse. A true old stone springhouse, the kind people built before there was any such thing as refrigeration. Built right over the head of a spring, so the cold water would run through a stone trough inside and keep the milk and the butter and the meat. And this one had been sealed up and abandoned and buried so long that the whole world had forgotten it. 3 owners and a bankruptcy, and 7 years of back taxes had come and gone over the top of it, and never known it was there. And when I climbed down inside it with a flashlight, my heart going like a girl's, I found the head of the spring, the very thing my grandfather had underlined and questioned and never found. It came up out of the living rock in the floor of that stone room, up through a bed of clean-washed gravel, and it filled a stone basin the old builders had cut for it, and it ran out through a channel in the wall as cold and clear and steady as it had run in the drought of 1934, as it had run, I would guess, for as long as there had been rain falling on that ridge. I dipped my hand in and drank, which you're not supposed to do without a test, and I did it anyway, and it was the best water I have ever tasted, and I sat down on the cold stone floor of that little buried room and I cried, which I am not ashamed to tell you, because I was 62 years old and I had just found the thing an 8-year-old girl had heard about in a truck cab. And the man who told her about it had been dead 33 years by then and had never seen it himself. I put the roof slab back gentle and climbed out. I had the water tested, of course, once I got my sense back. I drove a sample 2 hours to a lab and paid $90, and I waited 3 weeks, and the 3 weeks passed slow the way they do when a thing matters. When the report came back, I read it standing at my mailbox in the rain. The man from the lab had called first, actually, before the paper came, and that is its own part of this story, because he was a soil and water scientist who had been doing it 40 years and did not, I gathered, get excited about much. He asked me on the phone where the sample had come from, and I told him a stone Springhouse on a piece of ground I'd bought at tax sale, and he was quiet for a moment, a long moment, and then he said, in a careful flat voice not unlike my grandfather's, "This is exceptional water." That was the word he used. Exceptional, and coming from a man like that, it landed heavier than a whole paragraph would have from somebody else. He said the mineral profile was clean, the flow was steady, no surface contamination, no bacteria. And then he said, and I wrote this down, "Water like this doesn't happen by accident. Somebody protected that source a long time ago, and it held." "Somebody covered it proper," I said, and he said, "That's exactly what they did, and there was a kind of respect in it, one careful person recognizing the work of another careful person across 150 years. And I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen and felt my grandfather standing there with me. Now I had a decision, and I want to tell you the truth about it, because it would make a tidier story if I said I bottled that water and got rich, and I did not. What I had was 45 acres, most of it cleared by then, the goats having spent 2 full seasons eating it back to open ground. And I had an orchard coming back and stone fences reappearing out of the brush and a spring that ran, when I finally metered it, better than 6 gallons a minute, cold and clean every hour of every day, drought or flood, which is more good water than my whole farm had ever known. I did not need to bottle it and sell it to strangers. I ran a line off it, buried below frost, down to the low pasture, and it feeds stock tanks now that never freeze in winter and never go dry in August. And I ran another line up to the house I built on the ridge, and I have drunk that water every day for years, and my goats, which are near 100 head now and clearing my third neighbor's brush, under contract for good money, drink it too. And the Springhouse itself I dug fully out, and I did not change 1 stone of it. I only cleared it, and I keep the roof slabs mossed over and cool. And in the summer I keep butter and buttermilk in there in the old way, in crocks set down in the running trough, and it keeps them better than any icebox. And when my grandchildren come, I take them down the worn stone steps into that cold, dark room, and I tell them their great-great-grandfather knew this water was here before I was born, and their great-great-great-somebody built this room to keep it clean. And the water we are drinking was falling as rain on this ridge before there was a courthouse to buy the ground from. The neighbor came back, of course. He came the fall after I dug it out, and word had gotten around the way it does that the woman who'd wasted $1,100 on a briar patch had found something back in there. He rolled up to the fence in the clean truck, and by then the fence line he was looking over was open pasture, where the green wall had been. 40 acres of it grazed clean and greening up into fall rains, with goats scattered across it like somebody had spilled them out of a bag. He looked at it a long time. He is not a man who says much, and he is not a man who likes to be wrong. And he did neither of those things easily, but he did roll the window down, and he did look at all that open ground where the thorn brush had been, and he said, "Well, that's not the same place." And I said, "No, it isn't." And he chewed on that a second, and he said, "I heard you found water back in there." And I said, "I did, good water." And he nodded slow, and he said, "The last one," meaning the fellow who'd owned it before the bankruptcy, That fellow drilled 2 wells and came up dry both times, spent I don't know what on it. And I said, I know, I saw the old casing. And the neighbor looked at that spring water running down into my stock tank that would never freeze. And he said, you didn't drill. And I said, no. The goats found it, which was not the whole truth. The notebook found it, and my grandfather found it more than 30 years dead. But it was true enough, because it was the goats eating that green wall down to the ground that let me see the swale, and the swale that let me find the mound, and the mound that let me find the stone. And the neighbor sat there a minute longer, and then he said, the thing that I have kept, the small dignified thing that I count as my whole vindication. He said, you might not be as wrong as I figured. And he put the clean truck in gear and drove on up the ridge road. And that was all. That was plenty. And I have thought a good deal in the years since about why nobody found that Springhouse in all that time. 3 owners in a bank in the whole county. And a man before them who spent real money drilling 2 dry wells while the best water on the ridge ran cold and steady 18 inches under the mud a couple 100 feet away. And I think it is because they were all in a hurry, and they all trusted the fast, expensive answer over the slow, patient one. A well rig can be scheduled and paid for and finished in a week. A herd of 31 brush goats eating 45 acres down to where you can finally see the shape of the ground takes 2 years, and it doesn't come with a warranty or a receipt that impresses anybody at the diner. The man who drilled the dry wells was not a fool. He did the modern thing, the certain thing, and it failed him. And the answer he was looking for was sitting there the whole time behind a green wall, waiting for somebody willing to go slow enough to find it. My grandfather knew it was there and never dug it out. And I have made my peace with that too, because he was farming a whole place in hard years. And a man can know a thing and never get to the end of it. And what he did instead was write it down, cold and clear, must be 12 foot down. They covered it proper, and underline his one unanswered question in the margin of a nickel notebook, and let it sit in a cedar chest for me to find 77 years after he first wrote it. That is a kind of gift, I've come to think, the kind the old ones leave the ones who come after, not money and not land even, but a page that says, here is a thing I noticed and never finished. In case you have the patience I ran out of. And I did have it, barely and only. Because a memory in a truck cab weighed more with me than a certainty in a clean truck. So I'll leave you with what my grandfather might have said, if he'd ever said anything that wasn't about the weather, and it's only what his notebook taught me. That the land keeps its best things covered proper, and it doesn't give them up to whoever's in the biggest hurry or has the deepest pockets. It gives them up to whoever's willing to clear the ground, slow, and read what's underneath, and trust the water they can't see yet. The goats knew the swale was different before I did. The old builders knew that spring was worth 150 years of stone. My grandfather knew it was down there and left me a map without knowing he was leaving it. All I did was pay the back taxes and buy some brush goats and refuse to be in a hurry. If you've got your own piece of choked up ground, your own briar patch that everybody's certain is worth nothing, or an old notebook in a chest you haven't gotten around to reading, I'd like to hear about it down in the comments. Because I believe most of us are walking over something covered proper and just haven't cleared enough of the ground to see it yet. And if this meant something to you, sitting wherever you're sitting, go on and subscribe, and I'll tell you another one. Slow the way I know how.